In this video, we're going to look at writing equations of sine and cosine curves. So the first thing that we need to be able to do is to identify the vertical shift and the phase shift from the graph. We talked before about finding period and amplitude from the graph, so we'll incorporate that back in a minute. But let's talk for a minute about finding the vertical shift. If you can identify your maximum and minimum, you can get your vertical shift. So on this graph here, the maximum is 0, our minimum is -6, and so then my vertical shift is just 1/2 the maximum plus the minimum. So my vertical shift is at -3. Remember, your amplitude formula is 1/2 max minus min, so it's very similar to that. You're just subtracting for the amplitude and adding for the vertical shift. Phase shift is a little more complicated. First of all, there's a different phase shift for your sine and your cosine graph, and there's actually infinitely many phase shifts that would get you the same graph. So we're going to just try to find the smallest phase shift because it will make your life easier in the future. For a cosine curve, we want to find the closest maximum point to the y-axis and then determine the x value of that point. So looking at this graph, here's my maximum. So if I come down, this is the x value for that point, and I need to figure out what's between 0 and pi/2, and that would be pi/4. So for my cosine curve, my phase shift would be pi/4. For the sine curve, we want to find the closest midline point, which is increasing to the right of the y-axis. So remember, first of all, your midline happens at your vertical shift, so you might want to find that first. So if we look at this graph here, our maximum is 3 and our minimum is -1. So our vertical shift would be at 1/2, 3 plus -1, so it would be at 1. So you might want to draw that on there just to help you out. So that's my midline, and now we're going to try to find that midline point. So I want to find the closest midline point. Remember, it has to be increasing to the right. So I could come over here to the left. This is a midline point here, but this is decreasing, so I don't want to use this one. If I come over to this one, this is a midline point, and as I move to the right, I'm increasing, so this is the one I want to use. And then again, I'm going to come down to the axis, and I need to figure out what's between -pi/2 and -pi. So my phase shift here, if you need to figure out what's in between two values, remember, you can just add them and divide by 2. So here we're just going to take 1/2 of -pi plus -pi/2, which would be 1/2 of -2pi/2 plus -pi/2. So this is going to be -3pi/4. So that would be my phase shift for the sine curve. So remember, for cosine, you want to look for the closest maximum point to the y-axis and then determine that x-coordinate. For the sine curve, you want to find the closest midline point to the y-axis and then find that x value as well. The reason we're doing the maximum for the cosine curve is because, remember, a cosine curve usually starts on the y-axis at the maximum. So if there has been a phase shift, that maximum point has been moved left or right of the axis. A sine curve, remember, typically starts at the middle value and then goes up. So again, that's why we're looking for where it's crossing the midline point and then it's increasing to the right. So if we kind of combine all that together here, we want to find period, amplitude, phase shift, and vertical shift for each graph here. So the first thing I would do is always identify my max and my min. So my max is 3 here and my min is -1. From that, remember, you can get amplitude and your vertical shift. To find your period, remember, you're going to trace one cycle of the sine curve. So in this case, my period is going to be 8 pi. And then I'm going to find my phase shift in terms of both sine and cosine. So my phase shift for cosine, so this is my maximum point. So if I come down here, this is between 0 and 2 pi. So my phase shift in terms of cosine would be pi. And then I want to find my phase shift in terms of sine. So I want to use that midline value. So I'm going to draw that line on there. And again, I'm going to come over to here because this is the one where I'm increasing to the right. And I'm going to come down to the axis, and that would be at -pi. So my phase shift in terms of sine is going to be -pi. Again, over here, my maximum is -1, my minimum is -5, which allows me to calculate amplitude and vertical shift. Remember, to find my period, I'm going to trace one cycle of my curve. So I've got a maximum, I've got a minimum, back to that same y value, which is here. So my period here is going to be 8. And then I'm going to find my phase shifts. So my phase shift in terms of cosine, remember, for cosine, I'm going to look for a maximum point, which is right here. And that is happening at 1. And then my phase shift in terms of sine, now I'm looking for that midline value, and remember, my midline's at my vertical shift, so here. And again, I want to come to this one because I want to be increasing as we move to the right, and that's happening at -1. All right, so we pull all this together, then we want to take it one step further and be able to write the equation of the graph. So I want to find my maximum, minimum values, then we're going to calculate to find my amplitude, my vertical shift. We're going to find that period, highlight if we have to. Once we do that, we're going to calculate our b value. And then we can either write any graph in terms of sine or cosine, so then we're going to determine which one we're going to use. We're going to find the phase shift for that, and then we're going to write it into the general equations, which are given here: a sine, b, x minus c plus d, or same for cosine. So for this graph here, my maximum value is 4, my minimum value is -2, which is going to give me an amplitude of 3 and a vertical shift of 1. I'm going to highlight one cycle of the graph, which is going to give me a period of 4. So then my b value is going to be 2 pi over 4, which will reduce to pi over 2. Now if you're just writing the equation for a test or something, you could choose to use sine or cosine. I'm going to do both just so you can kind of see how either would work. So if we're going to use sine, we're going to look for the phase shift in terms of that midline point. So remember, my midline's at my vertical shift, which is at 1. So I'm looking for where we cross the midline. We're actually crossing it on the axis here, but I'm decreasing from this point. So I need the one where we're increasing, so I can either go left or right. They're both equally distant, so I'm just going to use the one on the right, which is 2. Then I've got everything I need to write my equation, so I'm going to write y equals, and then remember a is your amplitude, so that was 3. So then I'm going to put my b value in, which was the pi over 2. Parenthesis x minus c, which is my phase shift, so 2, and then plus my vertical shift, which was 1. If instead we work in terms of cosine, my phase shift, remember here I'm looking for a maximum point, so this one's closest to the y-axis, so I'm going to come down, and that's happening at -1. So my phase shift for cosine is -1, and then again I can write my equation. Y equals amplitude is 3. This time I'm doing cosine. B value is pi over 2. X minus my phase shift, so x minus -1 is going to give me +1. And then finally we've got +1 again. Notice that your equations are identical with the exception of your phase shift, so everything is the same except for the phase shift.